All right, I just want to say welcome to everyone and thank you for coming. It should be a pretty wonderful night tonight. It's something I've been looking forward to for quite a while. Um, it's been a while since Sarah Burney and I have been able to interact in a more professional way in a long time, and it's really wonderful to be able to do that with her tonight, as well as to talk about a subject that I think is not only very near and dear to Sarah, but also an artist who's been a great inspiration to me as well. And so, for those of you who've been involved in any of the book clubs before, one of the things we try to do with this is take stuff that was based out of the book and go deeper into it and get more backstory, because there isn't an image in that book that we couldn't have a 2, 3, 4 day conversation about its making and the history of it, how it connects to things about the artists themselves. And so this is a little bit of a way to try to help us all get a little bit more deeper into everything. And so each week that I do this, I have a theme, and this week's theme is printmaking as opportunity. And for those of you who are practitioners, printmakers yourselves or printers, printmaking has a seemingly never-ending source of opportunities for you artistically as a printer or an artist. There's always a different way to do it. Someone does something different than you do, a different way to think about it. And it's always presenting new creative options. But I wanted to think about that broad sense of opportunity for printmaking. And one of the first places to always start is what printmaking can and has done for artists throughout history. And Peter Bruegel, I think, is a prime example of an artist whose career was so positively impacted and shaped and formed by printmaking. And he was a designer of prints predominantly, and in the late 1540s into the late 1550s. And his job was essentially to draw images that could then be engraved in editions. And his primary publisher was Hieronymus Koch, House of the Four Winds. And that print shop is really the print shop that created the model of contemporary publishing we still use today. One of the things that most people don't know, if you aren't familiar with his prints, his graphic output, was that it was his print career that formed the foundation for his paintings. So most people, when they come across Peter Bruegel the Elder, it's through his paintings and his famous series of paintings that have a lot of relationship to Hieronymus Bosch. But what's interesting about that is he made about, I believe it was 42 paintings in his life, and 35 of those paintings were made in the last 5 years of his life. And it was because of his career as a printmaker that he was able to afford to be a painter. And I think that's kind of a big revelation for a lot of people, is that, the cost of being a painter, especially in the middle 16th century, was extraordinarily high. You had to make everything yourself, all your paints, and you needed help, and the materials were extraordinarily expensive. And you couldn't just generally afford to paint paintings and hope people would buy them unless you came from a lot of money or already had a buyer lined up. So for Peter Bruegel, it was important to build a name and a career. And his pairing with Hieronymus Koch made that possible for him to build a career through his prints. So his prints came before the paintings. And if you ever get a chance to see these engravings, I believe he made just over 40. They're absolutely astounding. Another artist that I think we can point to how printmaking created a lot of opportunities that might be kind of obvious is Francisco Goya. And the reason that I like to point this out is that one of the things that a lot of art historians have commented on over the years is that no one would have really remembered Goya had he not done Los Caprichos. It was this series of prints changed his focus as an artist and changed his purpose. It redirected his life in such a significant way that he's the artist that we know of today. So his work is often broken into the pre-Los Caprichos period and the post-Los Caprichos. And for those of you that aren't familiar with this, it's an intaglio series of images that's predominantly line etching and aquatint with a little bit of engraving. And the work was a first of its kind in many ways. It was one of the first major forays of an artist speaking about their time with their time. So he wasn't making a commentary on his own time through allegorical images, through religious stories or Greek or Roman stories. or, even pagan imagery. It was using the time itself. So in this way, he becomes what he's referred to as, the first modern master and the last old master. And the thing to point out about this that's so amazing, this is 1799, this predates photography. So his way of looking at the world and changing the role and the job of an artist was widely known, his intention and what he did with it, because he did that as prints. He only sold Los Caprichos when he personally paid to produce these works and have them editioned. And he only sold them in Spain for about 3 days when he was told by the Catholic Church that he had to stop selling them. And he was even only selling them out of a cigar store. And it wasn't like he was selling it in the main drag, but he was told that he needed to cease and desist. And so he did. And so the prints were only sold abroad. But it was through that he was able to influence a lot of the more famous French artists, people like Daumier and Delacroix. Delacroix actually owned a set of Los Caprichos. And that was something that was highly influential for him. So the reason we know of Goya, so much of it, is that one, this body of work changed the way he worked, and two, because it was an edition, it survived and it spread. And so as a result, it created a lot of opportunities, not just for him within his lifetime, but also for his work to continue to survive. So there's opportunities for legacy. And so I'm going to jump way further ahead and really talk about other things and aesthetically really different. But an artist who often gets lumped into other categories other than that of an artist is Sister Corita Kent. And I like to bring her up a lot, and she's in the book too. Especially making sure that she's right front and center in the history of screen print, because screen print in and of itself has a really mixed bag for purpose for artists. So screen print is often used to produce primary works, but also to produce ephemera for, performance artworks, protest artworks. It's used in so many different ways for art movements as well as protest movements and the music industry. You think punk rock, and I always go back to the foundings of a Lower East Side print shop in New York City, and screen print was their major mode. It was not only just for making art, but it was also for protesting for betterment of the community of the Lower East Side, the anti-nuclear movement, social justice stuff. And so screen print really allowed itself to fit seamlessly to switch between art as well as activism. And when we think about the foundation of fine art screen print in the United States, it goes back to the WPA and Anthony Valonis's handbook that he made for artists to learn how to do screen print. But we can't really forget the people who used that book to teach other artists. So someone like Vera Brock, who is an amazing screen printer. If you're interested in her work, you can look her up through the Library of Congress. They have a lot of her prints, and she taught an innumerable number of artists how to screen print. And so I always put Sister Corita Kent in here too, because printmaking provided her with a lot of opportunities, not only opportunities for activism within her community, promotion of the social causes that she was interested in, but also to create work that she could then sell for a more modest cost that she put back into the education programs to support her community. And so printmaking really created a way for her to spread her message as well as her artwork. And then to kind of jump to another artist whose life and career, William Kentridge, who has been so fundamentally shaped by printmaking. So when you think of William Kentridge, it's hard to not think about him as a printmaker. You think about his films and his drawings, but there's also all these major bodies of work. And being that I'm currently finishing up work on a book, catalog raisonné with Jacqueline Flint of William Kentridge's prints that have been published by David Crute, I keep going back to this particular image, that which I do not remember. And this image came about through a piece that he did for the Triumphs and Laments for the city of Rome. It was an ephemeral work. And it was a piece where they power washed the walls to create the artwork on the walls along the Tiber River. And it is subsequently, it's now no longer there. The grime of the city of Rome has turned the walls black again. But this particular piece came out of that. And the way to keep it out of the ephemeral realm was to make it a print. And it was a decision to take portions of that work to allow it to live. And so sometimes prints really create an opportunity for artists to take an idea and allow it to live again for a longer period of time. And this, if you ever get a chance to look into this body of work, I highly recommend it. which gets us to our guest tonight. I think setting up printmaking as opportunity was, I think, the foundational thing that Sarah Burney and I were talking about. So Sarah is an independent curator and writer. She's someone who I would say has one of the more unique perspectives on art that I really look to and appreciate and have a great deal of respect for. Her life experience is one that spans the gamut. And I think one of the things that makes her writing so great is that it's accessible, but it's informative and it's in depth. And so if you ever get a chance to pick up this book, which is kind of our jumping off point for our conversation tonight, is Directions to My House, that she wrote with Zarina Hashmi before she passed. It's an amazing publication in that I've picked this up 7 or 8 times, and every time I've looked at this book, I've gotten something wildly different from it. I've missed another thing. So line by line, it's for me, it's visual poetry as well as poetry in the writing. And so without further ado, I'm going to hand the screen over to Sarah and begin the rest of our evening talking about Zarina.
Thank you so much. I need to process that introduction for a second. That was so generous. Thank you both for me and for the wonderful book that Zarina and I got to work on before she passed. It was the project of a lifetime, really. And can everyone see my screen now? Yeah. So Zarina I'm just going to do like a brief introduction of Zarina's life in case there's anyone watching tonight who's not so familiar with her life, because her work really it's about her life. So she was born in 1937 in a small town outside of Delhi called Aligarh. And Aligarh was centered around Aligarh Muslim University. Zarina's father was a professor at this university, and Zarina and her elder sister Rani were the first generation of women in her family who actually went to college. And Zarina got a degree in mathematics and statistics, actually. And she had thought about becoming an architect. And I'm showing you the image of our book because this is actually Zarina's childhood home. This was the home that she was born in and the home that she grew up in. And she left this home around 21 when she got married. She married a diplomat, and she's so funny. She said, I was of 2 minds about marriage, but I really wanted to travel. So the idea of sort of leaving this small town in India was very exciting to her. And her and her husband, for sort of the next 3 decades, they traveled and lived abroad extensively. They were posted in Bangkok in Thailand, then they came back and they were posted in Delhi proper, not Aligarh, and then they went back to Paris, they were in Bonn, and then Zarina traveled by herself to Tokyo, and she lived in Tokyo for a year. Then she was in California for a year. Then she joined her husband, who was posted in New York. She was in New York for, I think 10 years. And then she was for about 5-7 years. She was between New York, Santa Cruz, and Pakistan for 5, 6 to 7 years, where she was traveling between these 3 locations all of the time. And then she finally settled sort of permanently in New York. And in these sort of 3 decades on the road, as she liked to call them, she became a highly, highly trained printmaker. She studied relief printing at Shilpakorn University in Thailand. She was at Atelier 17 with Hayter and Krishna Reddy, and she learned etching and viscosity with them. Then when she was in Bonn, she was making silk screens. When she was in Tokyo, she was actually working with Father Gaston Petit as a printer. He hired her to print his work. And then she was also apprenticing at the Toshi Yoshida studio and learning Japanese woodblock printing. And then when she came to New York, she was part of the Printmaking Workshop and Bob Blackburn's sort of extended printmaking family, as she liked to call it. And her work really sort of reflects this mastery of the medium. She's, I think, most well known for these sort of very graphic, cartographic relief prints. But she also created, this is her first body of work. She created these beautiful relief prints of assemblages of found wood that she'd made. She also this is an example of some of the silk screens she made after her time in Germany. She made really beautiful lithographs and etchings that are much more tonal. And she also made sculptures and works on paper on which I feel like she sort of transposed the language of printmaking onto all these other mediums as well. All the works on paper were often on printmaking paper, and they sort of retained that 22:30 ratio. Everything was additioned, and if it wasn't like an exact matrix that was being reproduced, there were addition variae. She uses printmaking inks in a lot of works that aren't prints. And her work, you know, she was a really cosmopolitan printmaker in every sense of the word. She brought a real global perspective to the medium, both through sort of her, it felt like an encyclopedic knowledge of materials and processes and paper and ink, but also her life. Her work was, you know, entirely about her life. She often said that when we were working on the book, she said, oh, my work is my first autobiography. And it really was. So her work was, it was so personal. It was so hyper local. But then at the same time, she was making these pieces that were addressing global politics. Then there were works that were very spiritual sort of later in life. And even her, you know, her minimalism and her abstraction, that's, again, it's very local in a sense, because it's rooted not in Western minimalism, it's rooted in Islam. You know, she was introduced to symmetry, geometry, and sort of a purity of line and space and form through the Mughal ruins that she visited frequently when she was a child. She lived near the Mughal complex of Fatehpur Sikri, which is this vast red sandstone Mughal complex. And she visited that all the time with her father, who was a professor of history. So he had a lot to speak about it. And I'm sort of, I've got this image up right now. This is a show that was up at the Pulitzer Art Foundation last year, Zarina, Atlas of Her World. And I love this show because they juxtaposed her work with her inspirations or the touchstones to her creativity. And what you're seeing right now is Home is a Foreign Place, which is, you know, arguably her seminal work. And in front of that is a jali, which is a stone screen that is very common in Mughal architecture. And Zarina always spoke about how that taught her minimalism before any Western artist did. And so there are all these really, really, I think, profound entry points to her work, but I wanted to end with these two quotes from our book. Printmaking is really, really the key, not just sort of in the affinity and mastery she had of the medium, but in the life that it allowed her to live. The medium really was the key to her being able to be an artist. And community. I think community was the biggest thing that printmaking did for her. So that's sort of the end of my Zarina introduction.
I think a good place to pick up off of that too is, you know, when we were speaking about Zarina's early life and the difficulty transitioning as a female Muslim artist, you know, in the 50s and the 60s, of trying to break in, at how the printmaking environments were really supportive in a really different way. And, you know, I'd love to hear more about how Zarina's introduction into Atelier 17 when she shows up in Paris.
So it almost started sort of before that, after she took her class at Shilpakorn University and they were posted back in Delhi. Zarina was hooked onto printmaking. She loved it. And so she was reading everything about printmaking, and almost every book she read mentioned Hayter. So when they were posted in Paris next, she was so excited, and she went to Hayter, and I remember when she told us the story, she said, I was so nervous because I didn't have an art degree. I had a maths degree. And she went to him and she was like, I didn't go to art school. And he was like, neither did I. And that was sort of it. And they became such wonderful friends. And he was such a great mentor to her. And not only did he teach her sort of the mechanics of printmaking, but he really encouraged her to pursue abstraction. Before that, the work she was making was very figurative and a lot like the work everyone else was making at the time. And she didn't like it. When she talks about her work, she doesn't actually talk about the work that she made before that. So Hayter really sort of changed her life. And every printmaking connection that happened built upon Atelier 17. When she was in Japan, she actually was in Japan for a 2-week fellowship, and she got there and she loved it and she didn't want to leave. And she was at an bookshop, an art bookshop, and she was reading a book about printmaking that was written by Father Gaston Petit, and Hayter had written the foreword. And so Zarina, being, bold as she is, she went to Father Gaston Petit and she said, I know Hayter. And he's like, oh, you know Hayter? Did you work with him? I need a printmaker. And she was like, yeah, I can print really great. So that's how she got hired by Father Gaston Petit. And then when she moved to New York, Krishna and Hayter both told her, go find Bob, you'll be fine. And so then she found Bob, and the printmaking workshop was its own wonderful family. And after, I think 2 years after she moved to New York, Krishna and Judy also moved to New York. And so her Atelier 17 family moved to New York. And then Krishna was the one who sort of got her the position at UC Santa Cruz. So Atelier 17 formed so many nodes within her printmaking community. So it was really beautiful the way it all just sort of kept building from that time.
Yeah, and it's, you had said something to me that I thought was a really wonderful way to phrase it, is that she felt like printmaking was a golden key. It was something that she could show up just about anywhere in the world, and that she felt that she possessed this golden key and she could unlock any door, because there was always someone who was connected in some way to someone that she knew who was connected through print. And I just always remember Bob Blackburn always used to say that, it doesn't matter where you are in the world, any two artists can always have a conversation because they share the language of art. And he would say, if you're a printmaker and they're a printmaker, you can have a more detailed conversation because there's this other level that the printmakers go to. And, her life really seemed to be the embodiment of that spirit of community and collaboration that comes with printmaking, and how she really built her life based on that.
Yeah, it really, I think key is the perfect word. And she often said, well, maybe if you could carry books, I would have become an architect, but printmaking suits a traveler. And, at the time, I think she was referencing, the portability of paper and materials, but the minute you walk into a printmaking workshop, and most of us need a printmaking workshop to make prints, you find a community. And for someone who had to move around so much, not always, by their own choice, that instant community really, it saved her. And she was, when she came here to New York, now there's a very large South Asian artist community within New York, but at the time, that really wasn't the case. And the printmaking workshop was very diverse. And so it was a place where she found people and she found her family. So it was beautiful.
Yeah, and I think, too, it was a space where what made you stand out was you, not necessarily the labels that could be attached to you, South Asian, Muslim artist,
Yeah.
female, minimalist, primarily relief printmaker. Those are all supporting details, not defining elements in an environment that was, so diverse in so many ways. And so there has to be something refreshing about being able to walk into a space where people just want to see the work first. And that's,
yeah. And I wanted to piggyback on something you said earlier. It also, after she moved to New York, her husband actually passed away. And so printmaking basically allowed her to be financially independent, because by the time she was in New York, she was sort of trained enough where she could start teaching. She taught at UC Santa Cruz, she was at Cornell, she was at Bennington, she was at Parsons. So it gave her a community, but it also gave her financial freedom, which a woman of her background, once you become a widow, you're sort of expected to go back and live with your in-laws. And, there was no way she was going to do that, but to not do that, she needed an alternative. And printmaking, I shudder to think if she was a painter, how would she have survived? But printmaking allowed her financial freedom. Yeah.
Yeah, it gave her that opportunity to pass on that knowledge too, because I think one of the things that is important to state is how much she was also seen as a mentor herself, in a way that she had been mentored by Hayter, that there was that continuation of how we pass on knowledge, but also pass on the inspiration of printmaking.
Yeah. And she took her role as a mentor and a teacher so seriously when she was at UC Santa Cruz. So she would be there for the school year. And she always talked about how it was the most beautiful print shop she'd ever seen. But she never made work during the school year because she said she found teaching, so she loved teaching. She felt it was in her blood because her father was a teacher, but she wanted to focus 100% on her students and not be distracted and sort of thinking about her own work. So she would teach the entire year and then only make her work when the school year was out. So it was very important to her.
Yeah, that level of dedication, I think that's, one of the other things to really talk about her as a person is how wholly dedicated she was to whatever task at hand. And that was the thing that would absorb her fully. I mean, I think, we take for granted that we expect that out of artists, that, that they're absorbed in those things, but she wore so many hats, and she had that ability to be that dedicated to all of those things.
Yeah.
So for you, I'm going to show a few images from some of the earlier part of her work. This was from an exhibition that you also worked on and helped a lot with. I want to point that out. That was at the Hammer and also went to the Guggenheim and was in Paris as well. And this is Zarina Paper Like Skin, which had a wide variety of work from some of the earlier pieces to some of the more recent pieces when the show had happened. And one of the things that I've always really liked to talk about when I think about Zarina's work in the early stuff is how timeless a lot of this work feels. So this is one of those relief print. It's a collaged wood print. So it's, for those of you out there, what it means is she found pieces of wood and cut them to refit them into the shape. So it wasn't carving of the wood itself. It was really more combining the pieces of wood in a way to make her composition and then ink them. And it's an approach that we can kind of take for granted today. And if you were on the book club last week, we were talking about Helen Frankenthal and her novel approach to woodblock printing. There was something about woodblock in the air at the time, but this was Zarina's approach to it. And for me, I always found that no matter what she was doing, the edges of things always seemed to be active and the work always seemed to be in motion. And so I was wondering if Zarina had ever really talked about what drove her to work with the found materials.
I was also thinking about the talk that you and Sarah had, because I think Sarah said this, the embrace of materiality of her materials. And that was so important to Zarina. And what's really interesting about this body of work, which she considers her first body of work, she was very strict about editing what she considered her work. So the work that she made in Atelier 17, she really considers that sort of her student work. So she's been doing all this very colorful etching, viscosity at Atelier 17, and then she comes back to Delhi and she has her own tiny little press in her studio and she starts making this. And it's so different to what she was making then, but it was sort of twofold. One, she was going through a hard time personally. And she said she found this like discarded pieces of wood and she found the wood so beautiful, but people considered it garbage. And she sort of almost felt like the wood. So she would pick up all this wood from the side of the road, she would clean it, she would oil it, she would ink it up, and then she would make these abstract compositions. And in these compositions, you know, she's thinking a lot about the artists she was looking at in Paris. She was looking at Malevich, she was looking at Brancusi. So she was thinking about other artists that had inspired her, but she was working in such a singular way for the context. Like right now in India, what was happening with her contemporaries, because she did form a, you know, an artist network within India, is very sort of figurative modern paintings. And then here she is, and she often talked about how she was not taken seriously because she was making work out of garbage. And not only was she using sort of garbage to make her work, but once she got to India, she had the hardest time getting European printmaking papers. It was very expensive. She was dependent on friends coming and going. So in this work, she's also using handmade Indian paper. And, you know, Zarina, she really understood her materials. She got to know her materials before she sort of committed to them. And she went to the paper making factory would be the wrong word. She went to the paper making villages in Sanaganer outside, like out in the country, and she learned how they made paper. So she really, really understood the paper and took time to figure out what paper, what inks would work the best with this. And she always, like in all her work, you can sort of see the materials that she's using, but she always lets the paper shine, the wood grain shine. It's never too sort of pristine.
Yeah, she really hides it. It's always
Yeah.
present. You know, for a
What did
lot
she
of
used to
artists, they
say?
want it.
I never impose on my materials. So she wanted to let them sort of shine.
I think that's a really wonderful, that lack of imposition, you know, that, and the confidence that takes to allow that to happen, to relinquish some of that control. And I think she makes it look so effortless to say, here is the image that I've made, but she's having to work with what she finds to turn it into this other thing.
And it's also her skill as a finder, you know, like I would have loved to see just how much other wood she had in her studio at the time, because being in her studio when she was working on paper and doing a lot of collages, like she would hold on to everything. A print would get made and she didn't like it, but she wouldn't throw it out. And so, and then 2 years later, somehow that would get cut up and used in a collage. So she was always sort of thinking on repurposing, not just repurposing, she was always aware of a material's potential. Even if she didn't see it then, she like knew that this could make something beautiful and powerful later, which I thought was wonderful.
It's interesting that she has the math and statistics background, because it's kind of like making it balance out. It's like working that equation until it equalizes. That there's that that knowledge that it can be worked out, and that it will be, you know, that solidity of mathematics, I think, definitely comes through. And, you know, for a lot of people who may be, you know, new to Zarina's work, you know, what can you tell us about how she felt about this period of work in relation to her more recent work? Like how did she see this work, that body?
I think she was always a little bit surprised when people would come to her work and all they're talking about is sort of Home is a Foreign Place or Atlas of My World, or these iconic political works. And sometimes she was viewed as only someone who's talking about politics or the longing of home, or, you know, sort of serious and sad stuff. But then she has all this other work that's whimsical and it's playful and she's just having fun. And so it would always kind of catch her off guard when she would be sort of presented as the somber creature, where there was so much play and inventiveness and sort of curiosity in her work. So she felt very attached to this work. This was her first body of work. The work before it, she was learning, and this is her, and she's arrived, you know.
So she sees it really as foundational, which you know, for me, when I look at that early work, and then you look at even Home as a Foreign Place, you see the building blocks for composition, you
Yeah.
know, structural arrangement, as well as the conversation she starts to have between other works. And
Yeah.
you can see all of that groundwork laid there, and then how she plays with scale as she goes, as you know, as she matures as an artist and ages. She very intimate things as well as much larger things. Yeah,
Yeah, and
so
in the collages that she was making sort of in the last, 5 years, I felt like we had just come sort of so beautifully full circle to this more abstract, playful, but somehow still very poignant work. And the negative space, I think the space was so important in her work. And it's really in these early works where she's figuring that out.
and I think yeah, I mean, to me, I also feel like her word use and titles that have that natural poetics to it, where when you think of her form of poetry as having space, that room between the words, and the ways in which the words string together to create that space, seems to really pair quite well with her work as well, as accommodating that space. I mean, for you, do you feel that some of that came from that early Islamic art influence, and you know, religious education as a child, that sort of being able to hold that that reverence?
Definitely. And also it was the culture that she grew up in was very language bound. She didn't grow up in a house of art. There was never any art on her walls. She grew up in a house of books. Her father was a professor. So yes, there's books, but also at that time in North India, in the Indian Muslim families, it was a very poetic culture. There was this tradition of sitting around and reciting poetry. Like people would know poetry off by heart. And a lot of the Urdu, which is the script that you see in her work, those are couplets from poems that she would have recited, that would have been recited to her. And that generation, my grandfather is of the same generation. He still would sort of hold court at the end of a dinner party and recite poems. And a person's intelligence was almost measured by the poetry that they could recite. And so it's so funny. She would always say, "Oh, I'm not a writer. I'm not a writer." But she was so obviously a writer. You just have to look at the titles of her work. She is writing poetry from the very beginning. And for a lot of her works, the title came before the image. And, she said that, but we would also see it happen in the studio. She would read something, or she would read a poem, and she was like, "Oh, I have to write this down. This is going to come back." And then, a year later, yeah, there it is. Like the print that you have in your book, Beyond the Stars, that couplet was something I think she said to me within the first year that I worked at the studio, that this is one of the most powerful poems she's ever read. So she was always thinking in words, and that's a product of her culture and her family, but also her affinity for language. She had such a natural grasp for language. Everywhere she went, she would pick up a language. She could speak colloquial Thai. She was most fluent at French. German, she picked up a little. Japanese, she picked up a little, but she had such an amazing ear for language. And she was also very passionate about the Urdu language. Now, for those who don't know, Urdu and Hindi are sort of the dominant languages in the subcontinent. There's so many other languages, but those are sort of the official languages, and they sound the same. Colloquial Hindi, colloquial Urdu is the same spoken, but they have different scripts. And she would always say to me that, "Oh, Urdu's dying out." And I would always get a little offended. I'm from Pakistan. I grew up speaking Urdu, and I'd be like, "No, it's not. I speak Urdu. My whole family speaks Urdu." And she would say, "But do you write in Urdu? Do you dream in Urdu? Are you reading books in Urdu?" And it's so true, like more, and every new generation is getting further away from the language. So putting Urdu in her work was sort of a political stance that, this language needs to be preserved, and I'm going to do it.
not just do it, present it in a way that has a added cultural value,
Yeah.
that, by doing it, incorporating it into her artwork, the visual language, showing it as a beautiful visual language, as its form, as its text, as an image in and of itself, which, definitely connects to some of the most beautiful handwritten Qurans you could ever see.
Yeah.
And that tradition of that the text should maintain the beauty and the movement, which obviously has a lot of parallels in Japan as well,
Yeah.
with Japanese calligraphy and that tradition.
And
So
it was such a complicated task because she wasn't like typing into a computer and printing it out. There is one Urdu newspaper and one major Urdu newspaper in Pakistan, and she knew one of the men who was the calligrapher, and so she would send him a quote. He would write it out for her. Somebody else would scan it and send it back to her. So it was so much harder, but it was so important for her to have the visual of the language, as you're saying.
yeah, and I think it adds a great deal aesthetically, but also on that conceptual level, because it requires that extra step. And I think that transition of her work, we'll jump around just a little bit in our talk. I'll share this for people to see. When she stopped using English in her work and switched to Urdu, so I'm going to share so you guys can see this comparison. We'll talk a little bit about it. So here is Home as a Foreign Place, and it's 36 different images, and it's if you've ever had a chance to see it in person, it's an amazingly powerful thing, and it takes a very long time to actually view, because you get drawn into each single piece. And there's some details of this, and you see the Urdu texts coming a little bit in here. And for me, when we were talking about the balance from like the print that I have in the book, Beyond the Stars, and some of the early pieces that were heavily reliant on English, I think it's important for other people to hear what you had said to me about that transition as well, what that meant for her.
It was such a wonderful moment when she was like, no, I'm not going to translate it. People can Google it. She's like, I don't need to explain this. Someone else can do the hard work because this is worth it. And it was so sort of, and she started doing this not only in her work, but, when I was at the studio, she would get interviewed a lot, and she would, drop Urdu words. She would sprinkle Urdu within her speech, and she would wait for people to ask what it is. She would not translate. And I think that's, so many artists and art professionals have been around Zarina, and she has impacted our lives. And I think to see someone saying, I'm not going to translate myself for you, is such a powerful example, to set as a mentor.
Right. And I think it, to me, it really piggybacks on a lot of the work she did in the 80s, especially like the 70s and 80s feminist movement, which a lot of that had to do about, how women are defined or have to translate,
Yeah.
and I, so for me, I when you were talking about that, it just really brought a lot of that foundational work that she was a part of back up as being yet another kind of line to draw of saying, I'm not going to give in on this, and I'm not going to, step back from this. But at the same time, she always did it in a way that wasn't an affront, and it was an invitation, right?
Yeah.
She wasn't doing it in a way that would push people away. She was doing it in a way that would bring people in,
Yeah,
inviting people to work.
It would make you curious. It would make you think. And I love that you brought up sort of that feminist work, because I don't think enough. She's often viewed like, oh, a South Asian artist, South Asian circles, but she was such a huge part of the feminist circle in New York. You know, she taught at the New York Feminist Institute. Ana Mendieta was one of her best friends. She was on the editorial collective of Heresy, so one of their special issues on third world women artists. She also co-curated an exhibition at AIR Gallery with Anna and Kazuko Miyamoto about, I think it was called Dialectics of Isolation, again, about sort of third world women artists sort of in America. And it was, you know, she was teaching, mentoring, but she was also learning. That was such a great opportunity for her. I think that was sort of the first time in her life where she finally had friendships with women who were like her. She got so much criticism for a woman of her cultural background and generation to be an artist, to decide to stop living with their husband, and then once she's widowed to continue living her independent life. It was very isolating. And then she found her people, and she found women who were making similar choices. And it was really, really life-changing for her. I'm so sorry, I forgot to plug my computer in. Just give me 1 second.
I'll pick up something here too, because one of the things that I was thinking about, just in hearing you speak about that, was that relationship to that early foundational work of using the found wood, of how you described it, as picking up something that had been discarded and putting it back out for people to see it for what it truly is. And I think that process of putting things back out for people to actually see them for what they are really resonates with her work within the feminist art movement in the 80s, as well as her own later work going on, and that switch to Urdu and asking people to do that level of work as being a continuation of that same determination, that foundational work of being like, here it is, and I'm going to represent this to you. You know,
and
so
this is something that you and I talked about earlier. It's almost like she kept shedding sort of stuff that she felt she didn't need. And later on in her life, she also sort of shed her last name. She went from always being known professionally as Zarina Hashmi to being like, I'm going to be Zarina. And it wasn't sort of this like a rejection of the label Zarina Hashmi, because on our book, it's Zarina Hashmi. She chose the full name, but she was unabashed about changing and growing and being like, I don't need this anymore. And the feminist circle was pivotal. I think it was key to making her stronger.
She didn't feel isolated anymore, because for a lot of her life, she had extended periods of isolation. You know, it was printmaking kept her connected, and the feminist community kept her even more connected, because it was, I mean, let's be honest, it was a great deal of time before her work was actually really recognized, to the level that it should have been much, much sooner.
It's been such a slow burn. You know, she's been making art since the 60s. And I feel like, you know, she's been steadily showing, she's been steadily being acquired, but, you know, teaching was what sustained her. And it's in the last sort of, you know, 10, maybe 15, 20 years where there is finally more and more attention to her work. She had the retrospective, which was at the Hammer, the Guggenheim, and the Art Institute. She represented India at the Venice Biennale. The show at the Pulitzer was actually, I think Frieze magazine named it one of the best shows of the year, and she's in all the major collections. It's taken so long. It's, you know, it's really happening, but I still feel like we're just sort of scratching the surface of her brilliance. I think as more and more people see her work, Yeah, I think she's going to be canon changing.
I agree. I mean, and I'm gonna show a little bit more because it's something that you and I have talked a lot about too, that importance of paper in her work. And I think, a lot of people think of her in the flat, kind of print world or the collage world, but physicality was something that was definitely important to her. And you can really feel that sense of physicality in her collages. But these are all cast paper pieces.
Yeah.
And there was that connection of her learning about papermaking in India. And you wrote wonderful about it in the book about how she really wanted to do other things with it, but didn't necessarily have access to the knowledge on how until she was in New York and actually did some work at Dieudonné.
Yeah,
And
she took a class at Dude. So when she was in India and she wanted to see how her paper was being made, because the paper she was able to source in India was so different from the European printmaking paper, which is so smooth and almost has a sheen, and the Indian handmade paper would just sort of drink all the ink in, and it had fibers. And so she was just intrigued. So she went and she learned all about how the paper was being made. She saw the paper slurry and she was intrigued. She's like, well, what if I put it on a plate? What if I cast this paper? And the paper makers were like, no, this can't be done. And she sort of kept thinking about it. And then when she came to New York, right at the same time where she was, part of the Printmaking Workshop family, the feminist family, she went to Dieudonné and she took a papermaking class. And the paper makers there were much more sort of open to her questioning the possibilities of paper. And then she built these plexiglass molds herself. She would, I think it was canal plastics, she would give them orders of these weird shapes, and then she was like screwing them all up herself and drilling holes in them so the paper would drain out. And then I hope everyone gets a chance to see these works in person, because they're so beautiful in person. When you see them, they look like stone, but they're actually cast paper. They're so light. And the color, and this is sort of the only time in her body of work where there's color in her work. And these are all earth pigments that she's added to the pulp. So this is not a layer that's been applied on top. This is, if you cut this in half, this is what you will see as well. And she made these beautiful, beautiful, abstract, minimalist cast paper sculptures, which to me, when you see them in person, I think they so immediately, it's the tactility of stone monuments, of Mughal architecture. And some of the red, it looks just like the red of Fatehpur Sikri. So it's this, she thought about one thing, she thought about another thing, and then 10 years later, it comes to fruition. And
right, and she ends up at Dieudonné, only a few years after they opened, and and I've talked at length with Sue Gosen, founder of Dieudonné, about those early years, and her whole reason for setting up Dieudonné was to experiment, which was the polar opposite of the experience she was having with the paper makers in India.
yeah.
So she lands in a world and in a place that's embracing the unknown, and it was kind of prepared for her as much as she was prepared for it. And I think there was that beautiful connection between those two things, that I feel like she almost always had that kind of magic or that luck of timing of, ending up in the right place at the right time.
She really did. And, there was a couple of these pieces when I was at the studio. So these were made sort of, these were made in the 80s, a couple in the 90s, but we had some in the studio that she was tinkering with. She didn't really like them. And so she would still order the Abaca pulp from Dieudonné. So she was still in touch with them. She'd still be like, I'm going to call them. I'm going to call Dieudonné and tell them I need more pulp. They'll do it for me. It was great.
Exactly, and they will. I mean, it's a similar environment. It's the printmaking workshop type of environment for paper. With that same level of experimentation. And I think, for someone who was so involved with her materials, that idea that you'd be able to start with the beginning, the foundation of what she had been printing on, that paper, and use that as the object, seems really a natural extension of her way of thinking. And I've only ever gotten a chance to see a few of these in person, And it is exactly as you said, it has that feeling of stone. And I think there's a visual weight to these and a presence to these types of works that is amazing that it is made out of paper. Because
Yeah.
it's the last material you would ever expect that to be made of.
Yeah, they're stunning works in person.
So for Zarina and her, I kind of was, in keeping this materiality thing, she did a lot of work with gold leaf. And I was wondering, if you had a little bit more insight for us into some of the significance of gold for her.
It's so funny because when people see her work and gold, and knowing her background, knowing that she's a Muslim artist, the first connection everybody makes is Muslim manuscript, the Persian or Islamic miniature paintings, which were very, and not just paintings, sort of the illuminated Qurans. Her favorite art object in the world was the blue Quran that's at the Met. And everybody sort of thinks of that. And yes, there is that. I don't think you can be a Muslim and not be a little bit of a gold-loving magpie. It's so entrenched in our visual vocabulary. But she told me when they were on the boat from India to Thailand, and the first thing they saw was the golden spires of the temple. And she says that gold has stayed with me forever. And it wasn't until sort of, the 90s, 2000s, where the gold really starts coming so forcefully. And in her work, where you see it, at first it's just a sprinkling, just a little bit, and then she makes this work on the right here, Blinding Light. And I love this pairing so much because, 2009 onwards, her health wasn't the best, and she was also thinking about mortality a lot and spirituality a lot. And in Islam, God is light, nur, and when you pass, you go into the blinding light. And the title of this work is Blinding Light. So that gold, it is a stand-in for sort of the next stage, meeting your creator. And she's paired that with Dark Night of the Soul, the piece, the black piece. And that's Saint John the Divine. That's a Catholic poem, so when it is just so Zarina, where she's thinking about mortality, but of course she's thinking about it in 5 different languages. And, it's hyper local in that it's Islam, but it's also universal. So it was, and the black that you see, again, she's so, materials was so important to her. That black is not black paper, that's paper that she's dyed with sumi ink that's from Japanese temples. And I remember whenever she was so in love with this sumi ink, and her long time studio assistant, Yukari Idemitsu, would bring this for Zarina from Japan. So she was very specific about where her materials came from. And when she used the sumi ink, she would like make a stop. She's like, smell it. And the smell of sumi ink is so wonderful. It's so earthy. And yeah, I love this pairing. And again, it's an extension of just how much she thought about each material. It looks so simple, but there's so much context for it.
Yeah, and I love this because it seems to pair as well, whereas that black makes you want to go into it, and that gold is coming out at you, and it's kind of like the fear to dive into and the reassurance to come back or envelop you, and it has that balance. And I feel like she has a great deal of that sort of understanding what her audience also needs, like how they need to be held or how they need to be set up to experience the work in the way that she wants. I feel like she really keeps the audience in mind.
Yeah, she was so both in her retrospective, this was the end. So the last thing you would see Dark Night of the Soul, and then you would be, I love the way you said it, enveloped by the blinding light. And it's poetry. It's like pure poetry when you stand in front of these pieces.
Yeah, and for me, like blinding light is isn't really about being hopeful. It's almost about reassurance. And and hearing you talk about how she was so deeply affected by seeing the gold of the temple, there must have been some level of reassurance for her, just seeing the gold and seeing the gold in a way that was reverent,
Yeah.
not in an imperial way, but the way in which she knew gold, that form of reverence. And I can imagine that it had a level of comfort to her.
She was so good at finding reverence, but appreciating reverence that was different from what she had been raised with. When she was in Paris, she would go to churches all the time. She was such a deeply, deeply spiritual person in the best way, not in sort of a dogmatic, doctrinal way. She was reverence, such a good word.
And image wise, I wanted to end on this one because I feel like it comes back around so well to what you were really getting at the beginning with her life, and as the kind of the printmaker as traveler. Shadow House for me, I feel like it changed after reading the book. How I looked at it, and I feel like it's almost like the home you chase. Is there anything, has she ever mentioned anything to you about this particular piece?
So what's so the image of home, which was always sort of, it was her main theme, the longing of home, the concept of home, the idea of home. But then this is a Mughal Jali. This is that architectural screen and the play of light and the play of shadow. And again, with this work, when you see it in person, this Nepalese paper it's so beautiful. It like shimmers. It's almost a little luminescent. It has all these beautiful fibers. But she made this work at Montalvo at her artist residency. And as she was getting ready for the residency, she realized she couldn't take all her printmaking supplies. So for a minute, she was kind of stuck as to, oh, what am I going to do? And then that studio was full of light. And so then what she was making was shadows. What she's
Right.
making in this work is really shadow, and that play of light and the divinity of light. So even though this is a much earlier work, it's 2006, it's playing with the same idea of home, of the divine, of
And I think about it, a work like this, not in a museum setting, it would also be playing with time, how the image would change throughout the day and be based on the way the light moves through it. In a museum setting, it's always perfect and it's always lit in one way, but the way in which she made it was something that was very present in the passing of time as well, not just in the cutting and that repetition in that, but also the way light moves through it over the course of the day and the seasons. So I just felt like I was just saying, for an artist whose home was kind of everywhere, this seemed a really poignant piece.
It is so that play of light, that passage of time, one of the first portfolios, sort of narrative print portfolios that she makes, Father's House, she talks about watching the shadows. And in her studio in New York, her loft studio, one side was all windows and she had blinds, and she would always sort of leave them partial. And, we'd spend the whole day there, and the way that it would move across, she would every time she would make us stop, like, look at the light now, look at that now. So it was such a part of her day. So this is someone who really thought about light in all of its sort of meanings.
I mean, we're kind of coming towards end of our time here, and this is a place where I want to toss out to everybody for questions, because we've kind of covered a lot of ground. And for me, that I've tried to explain Zarina's work to people, before. Like I remember there was a show at Laura Augustine. Wasn't her last show, it was the show before that. And I was in New York for like a print fair, and I had one morning to go see work, and this was the one thing I was going to go see was her show. And there was a couple people who I was trying to drag out, and I was like, you're in New York for all of, this time you're going to see the same 5 people standing across from you in your booth at this print fair. This is your moment to go see something that will change you for a long period of time. And that was really the way I described the experience of her work. And we were all late getting back to the fair. We had that little bit of time, and all of us were about 40 minutes late. So, that experience of her work in person it's undescribable. It's a transformative experience to stand in front of it.
She really had almost an annoying knack for picking materials that were so much better in person than they were in photographs. When you stand in front of the work and you see the surface of the paper or the way the ink has seeped in, if anyone gets a chance, if there's a show within 4-hour driving distance, go see it.
And you'll have to restrain yourself not to touch things.
Yeah.
I feel like with her work, it makes you want to touch it, but in the most gentle way possible. It's not like, I wonder what that feels like, grab or anything like that. It's this, you really want to be delicate, but you really want to know, almost as if by touching it, something additional will be transferred to you from it. It has that sort of physical presence. I've got a question here. Do you want to read that one?
Yeah, so someone asked about any exchanges between Zarina and Nasreen Mohammadi. They were born the same year and moved in opposite directions at partition, but in similar directions in art. They were friends. They knew each other very well. Zarina had, I think, 3 pieces of art up in her house, and one of them was a drawing Nasreen had given her. And they were both sort of outliers within their artistic communities because they were 2 women making very quiet, minimalist, abstract art. But they had a lot of love and affection. And I think if geography had allowed it, they would have been better friends, but they were always never in the same city. So they knew each other very well. And yeah, they were connected apart.
So really, you're gonna have to hold on to that. Connected apart.
Yeah.
Write that one down. That's a book title coming out for you. I won't ever forget that one. The question is, where can we find the book?
So the publisher, the Asian Pacific American Institute at NYU, they have a web store where you can order it. Laura Augustine also has it on their web store, and you can buy it in person at the gallery. I believe the Met bookstore, the Hammer bookstore, and Kettle Yards in London have it. So there's a few places where you can find it in person. But online, there's 2. Yeah.
And I highly encourage y'all to reach out and get that book, because it's the kind of book that you can sit down and read it in one sitting, but you're never going to absorb it in one sitting. It's something you can live with for a great period of time, and it's not only very beautifully written, but it's also a very beautiful book in and of itself. So the way the imagery of her life and her work and how that flows through, there's a lot to be found within it. So
thank you, Phil. I just want to, so the book is, so it's essays, but we've also got her artwork in here, and a lot of her personal photographs when she was young. And my favorite images in here, other than her art, of course, is sorry for this, should have earmarked this. So this is Zarina at Atelier 17 printing in a sari. And this is her, and I love this image of her in Japan with Father Gaston Petit in his studio. So it's a visual memoir.
Yeah, and I think it's a refreshing way to tell a story. And I think that for me, it does a lot of what you were talking, what she wants you to do. She wants you to investigate. It doesn't translate, right? It doesn't overly explain things, but it opens doors to where you're like, I want to know more about that. You know, for people who don't know much or anything about partition, you'll get a little bit of an introduction into that, and it's going to make you want to really know more about how low humans can go and the ways in which we treat one another, you know, and how formative of an experience that was.
Politicized her. You know, she was 10 years old when partition happened, when India and Pakistan, as modern states that we know them, were created. And her family, you know, her father was a professor at Aligarh Muslim University, and everyone was sure that Aligarh was going to get ransacked and looted. And her and her family, her mother and her sisters fled. Her father and her brother stayed. And she remembers being a 10-year-old and seeing, not to make this very dark, but she remembers looking out the truck window and seeing bodies. And she said that smell, she's never been able to get that smell out of her body. And so that's why her artwork memorialized every time a Muslim community was being ethnically cleansed, you know, or at risk. Like, she was talking about Rohingyas long before, you know, anyone else in the world started really paying attention to it. She made so much art about that, about Syria, about Aleppo. She was, you know, she has Atlas of her world, Atlas of my world. No, these cities blotted into the wilderness. This is a really beautiful, very powerful portfolio about Muslim communities that have been ethnically cleansed. And, you know, for a long time, she said she was an Indian American artist, but after 9/11, that she really started changing that label. She said, I'm a Muslim artist. You know, the seed, what she witnessed as a 10-year-old just kept growing and growing in her and made her so much more adamant to make sure those communities were not forgotten and those atrocities were not forgotten.
And that there was more to the narrative. I mean, I think that's always been a big part of her as an artist, is that she's always told a fuller story. You know, she's never allowed the story to be told for her, or, you know, that. And I think, you know, the fact that the two of you did this book together, I think, is another layer of that, right? I mean, is that, you know, she is her own author, and I think she tries to allow other people to have the license to do the same, like that sort of inspiration, that you know, kind of continual mentorship that she's provided.
It really was, and it was. This might be a weird tangent, but one of the weirdest things about writing this book is, so Zarina and I, we both speak Urdu, and when we talk to each other, we slip in and out of both languages. And one of the weirdest things about writing this book is trying to think in one language about, you know, all the stories in this book I've heard so many times, but to think of them primarily in English was it required some sort of little mental gymnastics, because, you know, yes, we're not going to translate, but, you know, we're writing for an English speaking audience. So it was such an experience. And I'm so glad we got to do this. I'm so glad the Asian Pacific American Institute at NYU recognized the importance of her story. And they also did part of her, she was the artist in residence, 2017, 2018. And part of the residency included doing an oral history, which they let me, you know, be part of that as well. And yes, she was old and she wasn't well, but I think we were all sort of caught off guard when she did pass. And I can't believe that we were lucky enough to capture her story. And I hope more and more people read it, because or learn from it. She was one of a kind. She really was.
it's pretty hard not to learn from it. I think you'd have to try really hard not to be changed or affected by it. And for me, a lot of my exposure to Zarina came through you initially. I mean, I had known of her as an artist and seen the work and liked it, but we had been able to spend time talking about her over the years. And sometimes that bit of personal narrative can really help inform the way in which you see the artist's work. And this is one of those rare ways in which it's not trying to create a cult of personality around the artist, which a lot of those personal narratives are. It's really trying to, put someone on a pedestal. This is really more walking alongside her. And I feel like that's more of a gift than anything else, because you get that sense to walk with her. And I think, it's something for any of the art writers out there. It's a big change we need in the art writing out there is that sense of walking with someone versus just looking up at them.
Yeah,
that's where we're going to learn the most.
and she was very committed to doing that herself. She really, someone just in the chat, Dorothy talked about how she was sitting next to her at the final day of her show at the Guggenheim without knowing it was her. And then they talked about her work, and she was so gracious, when we met. So Zarina and I met at my first job out of college. I was the front desk person at this art gallery, and it was in the heart of Chelsea. It was very fancy, and most people didn't even look at me as they walked in. And she came in, she's like, "I'm Zarina Hashmi, the artist." And I was like, she was already my favorite artist. I was so starstruck. And then she stood there and had a 10-minute conversation with me while the director and owner of the gallery are inside waiting for her, and that's just the kind of person she was. Like when the Guggenheim had her retrospective, she knew the names of all the guards in the galleries. That's the kind of person she was. She didn't want to she was always open to talk to artists, and especially students. It was actually very annoying working in her studio. Once a student bumped into her on the street, and they recognized her, and they said, "I'd love to get to know you." And she invited them over for tea. And we had so much work to do that day, but she met a young artist, and of course she was going to talk to them. And that's her. That's who she was.
I think, there's so many similarities to her and people like Hayter and Bob Blackburn in that kind of unending openness and willingness to share, and that desire to really help others better understand themselves, by taking that time, and helping them feel that value for themselves as artists, because they understand the fragility of that and how quickly that can go away for an artist. Sometimes all you need is that little bit of support. And she seemed to have unending energy for that.
Yeah, she would be too tired to answer an email to a curator, but she would talk to a young artist on the street for hours. And it was amazing. And Hayter had so much to do with that, because, she always talked about how she was dismissed by a lot of the contemporaries, because here she was, at the outset, she was a diplomatic housewife who was interested in art, but he took her very seriously as an artist from day one. And so she always did that in kind to everybody else. And she was completely uninterested in status or pedigree. She did not care. You didn't go to art school, she doesn't care. Neither did I. It was great. It was an inspiration.
Yeah. There was one other question, and maybe we can I think it might be a nice spot to end too, was about her interest in minimalist imagery being informed by her religious beliefs. And you spoke a little bit about it earlier, but is there anything you want to talk about with some of that?
I think belief might be the wrong word, because she was Muslim, and Islam is practiced very differently in, across the globe. But I think when most people think of South Asia, they think of colorful, they think of loud, they think of a cacophony, a sensual overload. But the culture that Zarina was from, which is, and just to preface, I'm speaking very, surely about this because I am from the same tiny sort of culture where it's very, it's all about restraint. It's all about cleanliness. It's all about open space, not overcrowding the senses, making like, in Mughal architecture, symmetry and geometry is almost sacred. Because there is no figuration in Islamic art, there is a lot of attention paid to geometry. So the practice of geometry as it happens in specifically Mughal architecture, which Zarina was surrounded with when she grew up, that really trained her eye to negative space, to openness, to the beauty of just a single line. And yes, Islam trained her eye. Islamic architecture trained her eye. And then she found minimalist art, but she would get very annoyed when people assumed, oh, she met Carl Andre and became a minimalist. Like, no, that's not what happened,
Exactly. It was more of she found her voice and
yeah,
that's the way she spoke.
yeah. She found other people speaking her language, but it was a language she learned at home, not in the West.
Yeah. Well, if there aren't any other questions, I think that's a wonderful way to wrap up for the evening. There's a little bit of housekeeping to do for what's coming up for y'all. I'm teaching a class on the history of print if any of you are interested through Manhattan Graphics. Starts next week. Still spots available. And then Prints and Their Makers won the IFPDA Book Award, which I'm very grateful for. And I'll be doing a talk on October 12th through the IFPDA's fair, and the link's there. And what the conversation of that talk will be is the real foundational backstory for Bob Rauschenberg's accident. And it'll be really describing the three hats, three roles: the printer, the publisher, and the artist, that all have to work together in order to make something like that happen. So it's to give you guys the fuller story, the foundation of what led up to that stone breaking and it actually becoming a print, and why that particular print helped change so much. And we'll talk about the environment. We'll bring it into contemporary work. So that's that lecture. And then in 2 weeks' time, the next book club guest is Case Hudson from Gemini. He's a master printer there. And we're going to be doing a behind the scenes look at Gemini's intaglio studio. And we'll talk to him about how he makes those giant intaglio prints with Julie Meritou. He's been her primary intaglio printer there for, like 15 more years now. And so it's a really fun way to get to see an artist's work from kind of in reverse, from the backwards end. So we'll talk about that. And I also wanted to just point out that Sarah's book is available and that she's available too. And if you have questions for her, you can always reach out to her. I want to thank all of you again for coming this evening, and please stay in touch. Got questions or comments at any time, you can always feel to shoot them out to me. And thank you again. This will go up online probably tomorrow or the next day, so you can pass it on to anyone who missed it tonight. Thank you all. Good night.
Thank you so much.